There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a lecture hall when an essay is being handed back, and I had grown to love it the way some people love rain. 300 seats, most of them empty by the third year of any program, and the only sound the soft slap of paper against wood as Professor Adelman moved down the rows. I always sat in the same place, second row from the back, beside the window that looked out over the quad where the maple trees were just beginning to lose their color. I liked watching the leaves fall more than I liked watching people, which tells you most of what you need to know about who I was before that autumn. My name is Tim Love, and for 2 years at that university I had been, by my own design, almost entirely unremarkable. I went to class, I turned in my essays, I went home. I wrote because writing was the only place where the inside of my head matched the outside of my life, and I had never once expected anyone to read what I wrote as anything other than an assignment to be graded and forgotten. Professor Adelman liked my work. She wrote things like exceptional clarity of voice in the margins and once memorably, "You should be terrified of how good this is," which I had folded into quarters and kept in the back pocket of an old notebook for longer than I want to admit. But admiration from a professor is a private, contained thing. It does not follow you out of the building. It does not change how people look at you in the dining hall. Eric Giles was the opposite of contained. He was the kind of person a room rearranged itself around without being asked to. Captain of the rowing team, the sort of build that made his university blazer look tailored even when it wasn't, a laugh that carried across the quad and made strangers turn their heads and smile without knowing why. People called him an alpha, without irony, the way you'd describe weather. He was not in my literature seminar by choice. It was a required elective for his program, and he sat in the front row with the easy, restless energy of someone who has never once worried about being unprepared, because the world had simply never punished him for it. We had exchanged perhaps 4 words in 2 months. He had borrowed a pen from me once and returned it the next class with a small, formal nod, as if a pen were a debt that needed settling. I remember thinking, in the brief window of time I allowed myself to think about him at all, that he probably did not know my last name. I was wrong about that, but I would not find out how wrong for several more weeks. It started with small things. A missing draft from the recycling bin near the writing center, which I assumed the cleaning staff had taken. A strange flicker of déjà vu when I caught him glancing at me across the room during a peer review session, longer than the exercise required. Once walking past the library's photocopy room near closing, I saw a stack of paper in a familiar font, my font, the one I used because the default on the lab printers was easier on my eyes, and told myself it was nothing because plenty of people probably used that font. And, besides, what would Eric Giles want with anything of mine? The night I learned otherwise, I had stayed in the library past 11, the way I often did when the dormitory felt too loud and my own thoughts felt too quiet. The upper floor, the one with the cracked leather chairs nobody used because the heating up there never worked properly, was where I went to be alone with a book I had no intention of reading. I climbed the back stairwell instead of the elevator, mostly out of habit, and that is the only reason I saw him at all. He was sitting in the far corner under the one working lamp, his rowing jacket draped over the chair behind him, and in his hands, held the way you'd hold something you were afraid might dissolve if you breathed wrong, was a stapled packet of paper. I recognized the slight crease where the staple had been removed and reapplied. I recognized the typeface. I recognized with a jolt that went all the way down to my shoes, my own handwriting in the margin, a note I had scrawled to myself about a metaphor I wasn't sure had landed. The kind of thing a professor would never see because I crossed it out before submission, except this version did not have it crossed out. This version had been copied before I made the edit. He had not heard me on the stairs. For a long moment, I simply stood there in the doorway of a room that smelled like old paper and dust, watching Eric Giles read something I had written about my grandmother's kitchen and the particular quality of silence after someone you love stops being able to remember your name, and watching his jaw do something small and unguarded that I had never once seen it do in a lecture hall. I must have made a sound, because his head came up fast, the way an animal's does. And for half a second before he composed himself, I saw something on his face that I would spend the next several weeks trying to name. It looked almost like being caught doing something far more intimate than reading. "That's mine," I said, and my voice came out smaller than I intended, more confused than angry, though the anger would come later, in waves, once I had time to think about it properly. He did not deny it. He did not even try to hide the packet, which surprised me more than anything else that happened that night. He just looked at me, and the lamplight made the angles of his face look softer than they ever did under the fluorescent lights of the lecture hall. And he said, the thing that would undo every assumption I had built about who he was. "I know, I'm sorry, I wasn't going to use it for anything. You photocopied my essay. I photocopied all of them." A pause, the kind that costs something. "Every one you've turned in since September. I want to tell you, I had some clever response ready, some line that captured the vertigo of being told that a person I had considered a stranger had for 2 months been quietly collecting the most private corners of my mind. I did not. I stood in that doorway with my arms crossed over my chest like a person trying to keep their ribs from coming apart, and I said the only thing that made any sense to me in that moment, which was also the title of everything that would happen between us for the rest of that year. Why? And Eric Giles Alpha of the rowing team. The boy whose name was said the way other people said the names of weather systems, looked down at the essay in his hands like it was something he had been keeping warm against his chest, and said, "Because I didn't want to read them just once." I did not sleep that night, which was not unusual for me, except that for once the reason had nothing to do with my own thoughts circling like water going down a drain. It had everything to do with him. I lay in the dark of my dormitory room, replaying the way he had said it. "Because I didn't want to read them just once" is not the kind of sentence a person says about an assignment they copied to cheat off of. It is the kind of sentence a person says when they have found something they cannot put down, and I did not know what to do with the fact that the something was me. He found me the next morning before the seminar started, which took a particular kind of courage I would not have credited him with a week earlier. The hallway outside the lecture room was crowded the way it always was. At that hour, students moving in loose clusters toward classes they were half awake for, and he cut through all of it toward me with the kind of directness that made 2 girls near the water fountain stop talking entirely to watch him do it. "Can we talk? After class. Anywhere you want." I almost said no. I had spent the night constructing several versions of myself who would say no, who would report him to Professor Adelman for the simple violation of taking copies of my work without permission, who would treat the whole thing as the strange and slightly invasive incident it technically was, and move on with the quiet, contained life I had built for exactly that purpose, a life with no surprises in it. But there was a version of me too smaller and harder to admit to that had not stopped thinking about the look on his face under that lamp. The particular tenderness of a person being undone by somebody else's sentence about loss. "The bench by the east gate," I said, "after my next class." He was already there when I arrived, sitting with his elbows on his knees and his rowing bag at his feet, looking less like the captain of a team and more like a person waiting for a verdict. He stood when he saw me, which struck me as old-fashioned in a way I found difficult to be annoyed by. "I'm not going to pretend it isn't strange," he said. No preamble, which I would come to learn was simply how he spoke when he had decided a conversation mattered. "I know how it sounds. I know what it looks like. It looks like you've been stealing my work. I never used a single word of it. I never even kept the early ones once I'd memorized the parts that mattered. I'd throw the copies out and make new ones when I needed to reread something. So there wouldn't be a paper trail that could hurt you if anyone found it in my room." He said this like it was a mitigating factor, and in some confused, sideways part of my chest, it was. "I'm not explaining this well." "You're not explaining it at all. You're just telling me the lengths you went to so I wouldn't catch you." He flinched, properly flinched, shoulders drawing in like he'd taken a hit on the water that the rest of the boat hadn't seen coming. "Okay, that's fair." A breath. "Can I just say it the way it actually happened?" I sat down on the far end of the bench, putting more distance between us than the wood strictly required, and folded my hands in my lap the way I do when I am bracing for something. Go ahead. The first one was an accident. I was helping Professor Edelman carry a stack of graded essays back to her office because I happened to be walking past her door when she dropped half of them and yours slid out and landed face up. And I read the first line because it was right there, and I have eyes. A ghost of something that might have been a smile, gone before it fully arrived. It was the one about the river behind your childhood house. The line about how a river doesn't care whether you're paying attention, it keeps moving either way. That's the only kindness and the only cruelty it offers. I remembered that essay. I remembered being embarrassed by that exact line, certain it was too sentimental, certain Professor Adelman would mark it as overwrought. She had circled it instead and written yes beside it, a single word that had meant more to me than entire paragraphs of other feedback ever had. I read the whole thing standing in the hallway, he went on, and then I read it again. And I thought about it for the rest of the day, which had never happened to me with anything I'd read for a class before. Not once, not in my whole life. I'm not built like you. I don't have whatever it is you have, where you can put your hand inside your own chest and pull out the right words for what's in there. I row a boat very fast, and I shake the right hands, and I say the right things at the right dinners. And I have never once before that hallway found a sentence that made me feel like someone had reached into me and described something I didn't know how to describe myself. The wind moved through the maple trees above us, and a few more leaves came down, red and gold, landing in the space between his shoes and mine like a border neither of us had drawn on purpose. So I started watching for them, he said. Whenever Professor Adelman handed essays back to the class, I'd find an excuse to be near the return pile before you picked yours up, and I'd photograph the open page on my phone fast before anyone noticed. Later I started actually copying them by hand in the library so I'd have my own version, something that wasn't going to disappear if I deleted an app or lost a phone. I told myself I was being careful. I think now I was being possessive of something that was never mine to be possessive of, and I'm sorry, and I understand if that's the end of this conversation. I sat with that for longer than was comfortable for either of us. The thing about being a private person, the thing nobody tells you, is that you spend so much energy building walls to keep people from seeing inside you that you forget to plan for what happens when someone climbs over anyway, not to take anything, but just to sit there and look around and tell you with complete sincerity that the inside of you is the most interesting room they have ever been in. Why didn't you just talk to me? I asked, finally. If you wanted to know what I thought about things, you could have asked. People do that. It's called a conversation. Would you have had one with me? I opened my mouth to say yes, because it was the easier answer and the one that made me look less like exactly the kind of person who built a life with no surprises in it on purpose. But Eric Giles had a way, even then before I knew him at all, of asking questions that did not leave room for the comfortable lie. No, I admitted. I would have assumed you were being polite to the quiet kid in the back row because you felt sorry for him. I would have given you 3 sentences and gone home. That's what I thought too. He looked down at his hands. They were rower's hands, calloused along specific ridges, and I found myself noticing this with an attention I did not examine too closely at the time. So I took the cowardly route instead, and I made a private thing out of something that should have been a real conversation, and now you know, and I'm not going to ask you to forgive it. Because I don't think it deserves to be forgiven that easily. I just wanted you to know it wasn't ever about getting an answer for an assignment. It was about the only thing in my whole week that ever made me feel like I wasn't performing. I did not say anything else that day. I left him on that bench with the leaves between us, and I walked back to my dormitory and sat at my desk for an hour without opening a single book. Which is the closest thing to crisis my life had produced in a long time. The trouble was not that I believed him. The trouble was that I believed him completely, and belief like that does not fit neatly back into the shape a life had before it arrived. For 3 days, I avoided the seminar's usual rhythms. I arrived exactly on time instead of early, so there was no window for conversation before the professor began. I left the moment class ended, weaving toward the door before Eric had even finished packing his bag, which required a kind of speed I did not know I possessed. He did not chase me through the hallway, which I noticed, and which I told myself I was not grateful for. A lie I did not believe even as I was constructing it. On the fourth day, there was a note tucked into my notebook when I opened it for the lecture. I do not know how he managed it without my seeing him near my things. And when I asked him much later, he told me it had taken him 2 failed attempts and 1 favor from a friend in the registrar's office who owed him for tutoring, which is a level of effort that should have alarmed me and instead made something in my chest go warm and unwilling. The note said, "I'm not asking you to talk to me. I'm asking you to let me say one true thing a week, in writing, the way you say true things. You don't have to answer, you can throw them away. I just don't want the only honest version of me you've ever met to be the one you caught hiding in a library." I did not throw it away. I kept it in the same notebook where I had once kept Professor Ottelman's note about being terrified of my own talent, which tells you, in retrospect, exactly how much trouble I was already in and did not yet have the vocabulary to admit. The second note came the following week, slipped into the same notebook with the same impossible precision. It said, "I have an older sister who stopped speaking to our parents 2 years ago, and nobody in my family will say why out loud, and I think about her more than I think about almost anything, and I have never told anyone that before, including her." I read it 4 times in the dim light of my desk lamp before I understood what he was doing. He could not write the way I could. He had told me that himself on the bench, with a kind of honesty that cost him something to produce. But he was trying anyway, in his own blunt, undecorated sentences, because he had decided that if the only language I trusted was written, he would learn to speak it badly rather than not speak it at all. I wrote back, "I want to be precise about how reluctant I was and how little that reluctance mattered in the end." I wrote 3 sentences on a torn half-sheet of paper and left it under the same notebook the next class, in the seat he had taken, to occupying 1 row closer to mine, without comment from either of us. I wrote, "I used to think being unremarkable was a kind of safety. I am starting to suspect it was just a smaller room I built so nothing could get in or out. I don't know what to do with the door being open." He did not write back immediately. He read it standing in the hallway after class, the way he had once read my essay about the river, and when he looked up, his face had the same unguarded quality I'd seen under the library lamp, except this time he let me watch it happen instead of being caught. "I don't know what to do with it either," he said, "but I'd rather figure it out badly with you than keep doing the thing I was doing before, where I figured it out alone with paper that wasn't mine." It became a ritual after that, the kind that does not announce itself as significant until you look back and realize it has rearranged the architecture of your whole week. A note on Mondays, sometimes 2 if the weekend had been difficult for one of us. We did not call it anything. We did not for a long while even acknowledge to anyone else that it was happening, and there is a version of this story where that secrecy was the thing that protected something fragile and new, and another version where it was simply Eric's old habit of keeping me private wearing a gentler costume. Both of those versions are true. I have stopped trying to choose between them. The first time Eric Giles asked me to come watch him row, I assumed it was a casual thing, the kind of invitation extended to a dozen people and meant for none of them in particular. I arrived at the boathouse an hour before dawn anyway, because some part of me had already decided that whatever this was between us deserved to be taken seriously even before I had a word for it. And I stood at the edge of the dock, in the gray light with my hands in my coat pockets, watching 8 men move a boat the length of a small building into black water like it weighed nothing. He saw me before he got in. I watched it happen, the small adjustment of his shoulders, the way his eyes found me, and something in his posture eased, the way water settles after a stone has finished sinking. He did not wave, he did not need to. The rest of the team noticed it anyway. The particular attention he paid to the quiet figure at the edge of the dock, and I learned later that several of them had assumed I was a recruiter, a tutor, a cousin. Anything except what I actually was, because what I actually was did not yet have a category they were prepared to imagine for him. Rowing, it turns out, is not a sport with much room for performance. There is no crowd close enough to impress, no easy laugh to deploy, just 8 bodies and one shared, brutal rhythm that punishes anyone who tries to be anything other than exactly as strong as they actually are. I watched him pull through the water with a focus that had nothing in common with the boy who charmed strangers across a quad, and I understood without him having to write me a note about it, that this was the only other place besides a library at midnight where Eric Giles allowed himself to stop performing. Afterwards, soaked and steaming faintly in the cold air, he climbed up onto the dock and toward me before he had even toweled off, which earned him a chorus of whistling from his teammates that he ignored with the ease of someone who had decided recently and privately that he no longer cared what conclusions anyone drew. "You came," he said, like it surprised him, though he had given me the time and the place himself. "You wrote me 4 notes this week instead of 1. I thought I should see what all the effort was funding." Please. He laughed properly, laughed the sound that carried across the quad and made strangers smile. Except this time, I was close enough to watch it start somewhere low in his chest before it reached his face. And something about being inside that sound, instead of overhearing it from a distance, rearranged a small, load-bearing wall I had not realized was holding anything up. "I wanted to show you the part of me that isn't words," he said. Quieter now, the team's noise fading as they hauled the boat further up the ramp. "You write things that make me feel like I've been understood by a stranger. I don't have an essay for what that's worth to me. I have this instead. 8 hours a week of doing the one thing I'm certain I'm good at, badly, until it's the only thing in my head." "That's not nothing," I said. "That's its own kind of honesty. Is it the kind you'd write a note about?" I thought about it properly. The cold coming up through the dock boards into my shoes, his shoulders still rising and falling faster than normal from the exertion. The particular vulnerability of a person who has just shown you the one place they cannot lie. "I think," I said slowly, "I'd write that, watching you do the thing you love badly on purpose because it's the only way you know how to be honest, is the most interesting essay prompt anyone's ever handed me without using a single word." He looked at me for a long moment, water dripping from his hair onto the collar of his jacket, and something passed between us that neither of us moved to name out loud, though I felt it settle into the same private room in my chest where I had been keeping his notes. "Come back next week," he said. "I'll keep showing you the parts that aren't words. You keep showing me how to translate them. We'll figure out the rest as we go." I did not know, standing on that dock in the gray cold of an early autumn morning, that I had just agreed to fall in love with someone. I only knew that for the first time in 2 years, I had left my safe, contained, unremarkable life on purpose, walked across a dark campus before sunrise, and stood somewhere cold for the chance to watch a boy I barely understood be honest in the only language his body knew how to speak. There is no clean line I can draw for you between when this became a friendship and when the friendship became something else, because I do not think such a line exists outside of stories that need one for tidiness. What I can tell you is that by the time the maple trees outside the lecture hall had gone fully bare, Eric Giles had become the person I thought of first when something good happened to me during the day, and the person I worried about with an intensity that frightened me when he went quiet for longer than usual. We had stopped pretending the notes were a private, separate thing from the rest of our lives. He sat beside me now, instead of 1 row up, close enough that our jackets sometimes brushed against the back of the same chair when we both reached for our bags at the end of class. We ate lunch together more often than not at a table near the window where he could still see his teammates without being entirely swallowed by them. A kind of geography I came to understand as deliberate, visible enough to belong to both worlds, private enough that the conversation between us never had to compete with anyone else's noise. It was at that table, on an unremarkable afternoon with rain streaking the windows, that he told me about his sister properly. The rest of the thing his note had only gestured toward. "Her name is Margaret," he said, turning his water glass slowly without drinking from it. "She's 4 years older than me. She was supposed to take over my father's company. The whole expectation had been built around her since before I can remember, And then 2 years ago, she told my parents she didn't want any of it. The company, or the life that came stapled to it. They didn't take it well. I don't know all of what was said, because I wasn't in the room, but whatever it was enough that she packed a bag and left and now sends me a card on my birthday with no return address. Do you know where she is? I know she's happy. That's all she'll tell me, and I think she tells me that specifically so I won't worry, which means I worry anyway, just in a different shape. He looked up at me then, and there was something raw in his face that the team never saw, that the dinners and the handshakes and the easy laughter never required of him. I used to think the cost of stepping out of the role everyone built for you was just disappointing people. I didn't understand until she left that the cost might be losing the people too. I think that's part of why I never let myself want anything that didn't fit the shape I was already standing in. Wanting things that don't fit seems to be how you lose your family. I did not have an essay ready for that. I had instead the strange and uncomfortable sensation of recognizing myself in someone I had spent 2 months assuming was nothing like me. The alpha and the quiet boy in the back row, turning out to share the same fear, wearing 2 very different coats. I built a smaller room for the same reason, I said slowly, the words arriving the way they did when I wrote, one careful piece at a time. Not because anyone left. Because I watched what happened to people in my family who wanted things loudly and it never seemed to end well for them, so I decided wanting things quietly in essays nobody would ever read past a grade was the only safe version of wanting I was allowed. And now? And now there's a boy who reads my essays in a library at midnight because he says, I make him feel understood, and I don't know how to keep wanting things quietly when he keeps doing things like that. Something shifted in his face, careful and hopeful, in a way that made the rain against the window feel suddenly very loud. What does it look like? He asked, wanting things loudly. I don't know yet, I admitted. I think I'm still translating. Take your time, he said. I'll keep showing up while you do. The first time he almost kissed me, we were standing outside the boathouse in the dark, and it had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the particular vulnerability that follows a hard loss. His team had been favored to win the regional regatta, and they had not won it, by a margin so small that 2 of his teammates had been physically sick with the unfairness of it on the dock afterward. Eric had not been sick. Eric had been silent in a way I had never seen from him. The easy charm gone entirely replaced by something hollowed out and furious in equal measure. And when the rest of the team scattered toward the bus and the comfort of being miserable together, he had stayed behind, and so had I. Say something, he said, staring out at the water, his voice rough in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. You always have the right words. Tell me what this is supposed to mean. I don't think it's supposed to mean anything, I said carefully. I think it's just supposed to hurt for a while, and the hurting isn't a message, it's just hurting. That's a terrible essay. It's not an essay. It's just true. Sometimes the truest thing I can tell you is smaller than what you want it to be. He laughed, a broken, unwilling sound, and turned to look at me properly for the first time since the race ended. The dock lights caught the side of his face, and I could see even in that uncertain light that whatever wall he kept between his public self and whatever lived underneath it had come down entirely, exhausted past the point of maintaining itself. I wanted to win this for her, he said. Margaret. I don't even know why she's never once asked about rowing. She probably doesn't even know what regatta means anymore. But I keep doing things like this, building these small monuments to people who can't see them, hoping it'll matter somewhere. And it never does. The boat still loses. The silence still doesn't break. It matters to me, I said, before I had fully decided to say it. I see the monuments. I've been reading them since before you ever wrote me a note. He went very still. The wind moved off the water, cold and smelling like rain that hadn't arrived yet, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all, which had become, by then, its own kind of language between us. Tim, he said, and my name in his mouth sounded different than it ever had from anyone else, like he had been practicing the weight of it in private the same way he'd practiced his notes. I don't know how to do the thing where I tell you what I actually want without it sounding like the most reckless decision I've ever made. Try anyway, I said. I'm good at translating reckless things into something a person can survive saying out loud. He stepped closer, slow enough that I had every opportunity to step back and did not take it. And his hand came up to rest against the side of my face with a gentleness that did not match the size or the strength of him at all. Like he was handling something he was afraid he didn't yet deserve to hold. I want, he said, to stop reading you in private and start being read by you in public. I want to stop being careful about what this looks like to anyone watching. I want... A shout from the bus, one of his teammates calling his name impatient and oblivious, and the moment did not break so much as it folded itself carefully away. The way you put a letter back in its envelope when someone walks into the room before you've finished reading it. He pulled back his hand, falling away slowly, reluctantly, and something passed across his face that looked almost like relief layered over disappointment. The complicated arithmetic of a person who had wanted to be brave and been granted instead. One more reprieve. Later, he said. I'll finish that sentence later. I promise you that. I'll hold you to it, I said, and meant it more than I had meant almost anything in my careful, contained life. He did not finish the sentence the next day or the day after that, and I told myself this was simply the ordinary friction of two busy lives. His training schedule and my coursework conspiring against us in the unremarkable way schedules conspire against everyone. I did not yet understand that something else was happening underneath the surface of those missed days, something that had nothing to do with rowing practice and everything to do with a scholarship committee, a conference room, and an old habit Eric had never quite managed to fully set down. I found out by accident, the way I seem to find out everything important in this story. A friend from the writing center, a girl named Priya who graded peer submissions for extra credit, mentioned in passing that she'd seen Eric Giles deliver a presentation to the Dean's Leadership Council. Something about resilience and identity for a scholarship he was being considered to represent the university with, and that it had been, in her words, the most quietly devastating thing she'd heard a rowing captain say in 4 years of attending these events. He talked about rivers, she said, not realizing what she was handing me. About how a river doesn't care whether you're paying attention, it keeps moving either way. That's the only kindness and the only cruelty it offers. I wrote it down. It was that good. I do not remember walking out of the writing center. I remember standing on the quad afterward with my heart going too fast. The particular vertigo of recognizing your own sentence, the one you bled to write, the one your professor circled and wrote yes beside, coming out of someone else's mouth in front of a room full of people who would never know it had not been born in him. I confronted him that evening outside the boathouse, the same place he had almost finished a sentence weeks earlier, and this time there was no gentleness in the way I said his name. You used my line. In front of the Dean's Council. You stood up there and you took the sentence about the river and you said it like it was yours. He did not try to deny it, which by then I should have expected, and which somehow made it worse rather than better. Tim, I trusted you. After the library, after everything you told me about not wanting to just take from me, I trusted that this was different. And then the first real chance you got to be impressive in front of people who matter to your future, you went right back to the same well. It wasn't like that. Then tell me what it was like. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture of a person searching for words that did not come as easily to him as they came to me, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for him. Before I remembered that feeling sorry for him was not the same as being owed an apology by him. I panicked, he said finally. I had 4 minutes to explain why I deserved that scholarship. Why I was more than a rowing captain with good grades, and every word I tried to use felt like a costume, something borrowed that didn't fit. And then your line came into my head, the way it always does when I need to understand something, and I said it because it was the only true thing I had access to in that moment. I didn't think about what it would cost you. I only thought about what it would give me. And that's the same selfish thing I did in the library, just dressed up in a suit this time, instead of hiding in a stairwell. Do you understand what it feels like? I said, my voice shaking now in a way I hated. To find out the most honest thing you've ever written about your own grief got repurposed as someone else's bid for a scholarship? That sentence wasn't a tool, Eric. It was my grandmother. It was the actual shape of losing her, and you used it to win something. I know. His voice had gone very quiet. I know. And I don't have a version of this where I tell you it's fine, because it isn't. I took something that cost you something real and I spent it on myself, and I can't give it back. And I understand if that's the second time I've broken whatever this is between us in exactly the same way. I did not have an answer for him that night. I turned and walked back toward my dormitory in the dark, and for the first time since the bench by the east gate, I did not look back to see whether he was watching me go. I stopped going to the boathouse. I stopped sitting beside him in the lecture hall, retreating instead to my old seat by the window, the one that had been safe for 2 years precisely because nobody important sat close enough to require anything of me. He did not write me a note that week, and I told myself I was relieved, and I told myself this so many times that I almost believed it by Thursday, which is the precise moment I knew it was a lie, because true relief does not require that much convincing. I wrote instead, the way I always had before. There was a boy in a library to complicate it. I wrote an essay for no class, no assignment, just for the private accounting of it, about what it costs to be a quiet person who finally lets someone read the inside of your chest, only to learn that being read and being understood are not always the same gift. I wrote about rivers again, because I could not seem to stop, except this time, the river was not about my grandmother. It was about how a thing that moves can also be a thing that erodes, slowly, the same banks it once seemed to be merely passing through. Professor Adelman handed it back to me 3 days later with a note in the margin that said simply, "Who hurt you, and are they worth this much craft?" And I laughed for the first time in a week. Alone in my dormitory room, a small and slightly broken sound. Priya found me at the writing center on the 5th day. The same friend who had unknowingly delivered the news that started all of this. And she sat across from me with the particular bluntness of someone who has decided you need a friend more than you need tact. "He's been awful at practice," she said. "My roommate's on the team. She says he's rowing like he's trying to put a hole in the boat. The coach pulled him aside twice this week. That's not my problem to fix. I didn't say it was. I'm just telling you what's happening because I think you'd want to know, and because I think you're the kind of person who pretends not wanting to know is the same as not caring, and it isn't, and you know it isn't." And I did not have an answer for her either, but I kept the information the way I kept all difficult things, folded carefully into a part of myself. I would have to open again eventually, whether I wanted to or not. It was Eric himself who finally forced the opening, 6 days after the boathouse, in the most Eric way possible, which is to say, without warning and without the careful staging he usually applied to everything in his public life. He was waiting outside my dormitory building in the rain when I came back from the library, no jacket soaked through in a way that suggested he had been standing there a very long time. And when he saw me, his whole body did something I can only describe as relief, mixed with terror, in equal measure the same arithmetic I'd seen on the dock the night he almost finished a sentence. "I'm not going to follow you inside," he said, before I could say anything at all. "I just need you to hear one thing, and then you can close the door and I won't come back unless you tell me to." I stood under the awning, dry, watching the rain run down his face like it had no intention of stopping anytime soon, and I said nothing, which he seemed to take correctly as permission to continue. "I went back to the library," he said, rain dripping from his hair onto his collar, his voice carrying clearly even though he was not raising it. The particular focus of a person who has rehearsed something so many times, it has stopped sounding rehearsed and started sounding simply true. "The night after you found out about the scholarship, I sat in the same chair under the same lamp, and I went through every copy I'd ever made of your essays all the way back to the first one I read by accident in the hallway. And I want to tell you what I found, because I don't think I understood it myself until I laid them all out in order." I did not invite him to come closer, and he did not try to. He simply stood in the rain and let the distance between us stay exactly as wide as I had made it. The early ones I kept because they made me feel something I didn't have a name for. I told myself that was the whole of it, an itch I was scratching. But laid out in order, month by month, I can see myself in the choices I made about which lines to underline, which paragraphs I copied twice because the first copy got smudged and I couldn't stand to lose it. I wasn't collecting essays, Tim. I was building a map of you, one piece at a time, long before I let myself admit that's what falling for someone even looks like. Because I'd spent my whole life believing the only safe way to want something was to want it from a careful distance where it couldn't be taken from me the way Margaret was taken, the way every soft thing in my family gets a price tag eventually. That doesn't excuse the scholarship. I know, I'm not asking it to. I'm telling you the truth because you're the only person who's ever made me believe the truth was worth more than the performance, and then, the first real test of that belief, I failed it. Because old habits don't care how much you've grown, they just wait for the moment you're tired enough to reach for them again. He swallowed, and for the first time since I'd known him, Eric Giles looked entirely unsure of himself. No captain's posture, no easy charm, just a soaked, shivering boy standing in the rain outside a building he wasn't allowed into. I withdrew from the scholarship consideration this morning. I told the dean's office I'd plagiarized a key part of my presentation from a source I couldn't credit without compromising someone else's privacy, and that I'd rather lose the opportunity honestly than keep something I got by taking from you. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. Not for you, for me. Because the version of me that wins things by hollowing out the people who trust him is exactly the version of me I've been trying to stop being since the night you caught me in that library, and I can't keep asking you to believe I'm trying if I'm not willing to lose something to prove it. The rain had soaked entirely through his shirt now, and he was shaking slightly, though whether from cold or from something else I could not tell, and did not, in that moment, particularly care to separate. I'm not going to pretend the scholarship fixes what it cost you, he went on. I know it doesn't put the line back the way it was before, private and only yours. I just need you to know that the next time I have 4 minutes to explain why I matter to anyone, I'm going to have to find my own true thing to say. Because I don't get to borrow yours anymore, and that terrifies me more than losing the regatta did because it means I have to find out whether there's anything underneath all this that's actually mine. There is, I said before. I had decided to say it, the words arriving the way they always did, one careful piece at a time. Except this time I was saying them out loud instead of writing them down where it was safe. I've watched you find it. On the dock, in the boat, in the way you talk about Margaret like she's a wound you keep tending instead of one you've let scar over wrong. You have plenty that's yours, Eric. You've just spent so long being told the version of you that performs is the only version anyone wants that you stopped trusting the other one to be enough on its own. He looked at me like I had just handed him something he had been trying to read in the dark for a very long time. Say that again. Slower. I want to remember it exactly. I'm not going to copy myself for you, I said, and something in my voice had gone soft despite the effort I was making to stay angry. Because the truth was, I had stopped being angry days ago and had simply been too proud, too careful, too contained to admit it. If you want to remember what I sound like, you're going to have to stand close enough to hear me the first time. He crossed the distance I had built between us so slowly that I had time to step back the entire way and chose instead to stay exactly where I was, which I understood even as it was happening, to be its own kind of answer. Can I? He started and did not finish the question, because some questions are better asked with the whole of a person than with words alone, and Eric Giles, for all his trouble with sentences, had never once struggled to say true things with his hands, with his shoulders, with the particular careful gentleness he brought to anything he had decided mattered. Finish the sentence from the dock, I said instead, my own voice unsteady now in a way I no longer had the energy to hide. You never told me what you wanted. You got interrupted. I've been waiting weeks to hear the rest of it. Rain ran down the side of his face, and he did not wipe it away, did not break the small, charged distance between us to do anything except keep looking at me like I was the only steady thing left in a world that had been moving too fast for him for a very long time. "I want to stop being careful about what this looks like to anyone watching," he said, picking up exactly where the shout from the bus had cut him off, as though the sentence had simply been waiting, folded and patient for the right moment to finish unfolding. "I want to walk into the dining hall and sit at your table because I want to be there, not because the geography is convenient. I want the next time someone says my name like it's weather for them to also know your name because where I am, you are. And I'm done pretending that's a coincidence or a friendship or anything smaller than what it actually is. I want to be the kind of alpha who isn't afraid of being known by exactly one person more deeply than he's ever let anyone know him, even if that means giving up the version of myself that only knows how to be impressive. I want." His voice caught, the first time I had ever heard it catch on anything. "I want you, Tim. Not your essays. Not the version of you I built out of paper because I was too much of a coward to ask for the real thing. You. However you'll let me have you, for however long you'll let me try." I stepped into the rain, finally closing the last of the distance myself because I had spent 2 years building a life with no surprises in it on purpose, and I had decided, somewhere between the bench and the boathouse, and this doorway, that I was done being safe in a way that left me untouched. "I've been writing about you for weeks," I admitted, my own voice breaking now too, the rain soaking through my collar in a way I no longer minded at all. "Essays I never turned in. I told myself they were just exercises. They weren't. They were the same thing you were doing in that library, except I had the better cover story because nobody questions a writer for writing." "Show me," he said. "Not now. Eventually, I want to read every one. You'll have to ask this time. No more catching me by accident in a stairwell." "I'm asking," he said, and the rain did not stop, and the building behind me did not become any warmer, and none of it mattered at all because his hand found the side of my face again. The same gentle, careful weight as the night on the dock, except this time, there was no shout from a bus, no impatient teammate. Nothing left standing between the sentence and the thing it had been trying to become since the moment I found him under that lamp, with my own handwriting in his hands. He kissed me like he wrote his notes plainly without decoration, like a person who has decided that the truest things don't need to be dressed up to matter, and I kissed him back the way I wrote my essays, carefully, like I was choosing every word on purpose, and somewhere in the space between those two languages we built, finally the first sentence that belonged to both of us at once. Spring came late that year, the way it often does, and by the time the maple trees outside the lecture hall had gone green again, the strangeness of being known by Eric Giles in public had worn down into something closer to simply being known, period, which I've come to think is the entire quiet miracle of loving someone for long enough. He still rows. He still has the kind of laugh that turns heads across a quad and makes strangers smile without knowing why, except now, more often than not, I am the reason for it. The joke he is laughing at delivered low enough that only I catch the whole of it. He sits at my table in the dining hall on purpose now, and the geography of where we are visible together has stopped being a careful negotiation and started being simply where we happen to be. He still writes me notes, though they have grown longer, more confident, occasionally even good, in the particular blunt way that is entirely his own and that I would not trade for polish if you offered it to me. He keeps every essay I have written since the library, not in secret anymore, not photocopied and hidden in a stairwell, but openly in a drawer in his desk that he showed me without being asked. The way you show someone a thing you are no longer ashamed of wanting. Professor Adelman, for what it's worth, never asked why my essays that spring kept circling back to rivers and rowboats, and the particular grace of a thing that moves through water without losing the truest version of itself underneath. She simply wrote, "Yes," in the margin. Again, the same single word she had given me once before, and I have come to understand that some sentences are worth writing more than once in more than one season, to more than one version of the same trembling, hopeful question. I do not know, even now, whether I would call myself unremarkable anymore. I think I have simply become a different kind of remarkable, the kind that does not need a whole quad rearranging itself around me to know it is real because there is one person. Calloused hands and an easy laugh and a heart he spent years keeping carefully guarded, who reads me now in daylight in public, asking every time, and who I read back just as openly. Two languages finally translating each other without anyone needing to hide in a library to make it happen. He finished that sentence on the dock, eventually, properly, the night the rain would not stop, and neither would either of us. But the truth is, he has kept finishing it every day since, in small ways, in the particular care he takes with my name, in the drawer of essays he is no longer afraid to show anyone, in the way he still, after everything, asks before he reads. I let him. I think I will keep letting him for as long as he keeps asking, which, judging by the boy I have come to know underneath the alpha, everyone else still sees first, is going to be for a very long time. If you made it to the end, you're my kind of person. Leave a subscribe, comment down your favorite part of the story, and if you want early access to videos, exclusive content, or just want to support the channel, hit that join button right below the video. Even one member genuinely means the world to me. See you in the next one.